It was a typical sunny afternoon in Sacramento. The streets were bathed in the warm glow of the sun, casting long shadows from the nearby trees. Eric Porter, a well-dressed black man in his early 40s, cruised through the quiet suburban neighborhood in his sleek sedan. The day had been long, and as he made his way home, he was eager to unwind. The hum of the engine provided a soothing backdrop, the rhythmic sound almost meditative, offering a brief respite from his stressful workday. Eric had just wrapped up a series of meetings at his law office. Internal affairs had been keeping him busy with a growing list of complaints against officers within the department. It was a job that often felt thankless, but Eric had always been driven by the belief that justice and accountability were paramount. He didn't mind the long hours, the scrutiny, or the strain it put on his personal life. What he cared about was making sure the system remained as fair as it could be, even when those in power tried to subvert it. His phone buzzed briefly in his pocket, a message from his partner. "Dinner tonight?" He smiled at the simple text, already anticipating the quiet evening at home. But as he approached a familiar intersection near his neighborhood, the faint blue and red lights of a police cruiser flashed behind him. A slight sigh escaped Eric's lips as he turned his indicator and pulled over to the side of the road. Routine traffic stops were common, but they never failed to spark a slight unease in him. No matter how calm or composed he felt, there was always that moment of vulnerability, the moment where everything was judged by the color of his skin. The officer's vehicle pulled in behind him with a screech of its tires. The officer stepped out quickly, his boots hitting the pavement with a firm thud. The officer had a standard-issue uniform, a young man in his 30s with a clean-cut buzz haircut and a determined stride. Officer Bradley Larson was the type who carried himself with the arrogance of someone who knew the power his badge afforded him. He approached Eric's vehicle, his eyes scanning every detail, his gaze lingering longer than necessary. "License and registration!" the officer barked, the words dripping with authority. Eric complied without hesitation. He reached over to the glove compartment and pulled out the requested documents. His movements were deliberate, slow, and calm, betraying no hint of panic. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. There was something about the officer's approach that rubbed him the wrong way. As the officer took the documents, Eric could feel the weight of the scrutiny, the way Larson's eyes flicked over him, his posture slightly changing as he processed what he was seeing. Eric had grown accustomed to this kind of treatment, being looked at as though he didn't belong, being profiled before anyone had a chance to hear his name. The officer didn't ask about his job, his purpose on the road, or any valid reason for the stop. It was as if Larson had already decided something about him before the interaction had even begun. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Officer Larson asked, his voice flat but laced with a hint of suspicion. Eric paused for a brief moment, carefully considering his response. "I'm not sure, officer. I slowed down for the light, but it may have turned red as I crossed it." "Not good enough," Larson shot back, leaning in closer to the car window, his eyes narrowing with a critical gaze. "You didn't come to a complete stop back there." "I saw it." Eric raised an eyebrow, sensing the tension beginning to build. "With all due respect, officer, I'm certain I did. But if you think otherwise, I'm happy to comply." Larson didn't respond right away. Instead, he lingered, his hand subtly resting on his gun holster as he sized Eric up. The sense of authority Larson projected was palpable, as if this encounter was about more than just a traffic violation. There was something personal in his tone now, an unspoken message that he wasn't just doing his job, he was asserting his dominance. As Larson stepped back, he scanned the interior of the car, pausing when his eyes fell on Eric's tailored suit. The officer's glance lingered for a second longer, and then his expression shifted slightly, just enough for Eric to notice. "Where are you headed in such a hurry?" Larson asked, his voice turning from professional to more confrontational. Eric felt a flash of irritation. It was an innocent question, but it wasn't the kind of question that was asked of everyone. The tone, the way Larson spoke, made it clear that it wasn't about the destination. It was about trying to make Eric feel out of place. "I'm going home," Eric replied coolly, his gaze locking with Larson's. "Just finishing up some work." Right, Larson said, his lips curling into a small smirk. And you're not from around here, are you? Eric didn't flinch, though he could feel his muscles tense up. He'd been through this enough to recognize the subtle racial profiling at play. It wasn't the first time he'd been made to feel like he didn't belong in a neighborhood where people like him were seen as outsiders. The unspoken assumption was clear. You're not one of us. Eric leaned back slightly in his seat, his eyes scanning the officer's face for any clue as to what would come next. There was a slight flicker of something in Larson's eyes, a mixture of arrogance and disbelief that Eric was even questioning his authority. But Eric didn't react with anger. Instead, he gave a calm nod and waited. Is there something else, officer? Eric asked politely, his voice steady. If I've done something wrong, I'd be happy to resolve it quickly. Larson's expression shifted, the condescending smirk disappearing as his eyes narrowed further. The officer looked Eric over one last time, as if searching for any reason, any excuse, to escalate the situation. This wasn't just a traffic stop anymore. It was a game of power, and Eric had become the target. Larson straightened up, clearly annoyed that Eric wasn't reacting the way he expected. Instead of showing fear or frustration, Eric remained calm and collected, as if he had been through this kind of thing 100 times before. And in a way, he had. Step out of the car, Larson ordered, his voice sharp now, laced with a new level of authority. Eric blinked, taken aback by the sudden demand. Is there a reason I need to get out of the car, officer? Larson's eyes flickered with irritation. I'm asking you to step out. I think you're hiding something. Eric's calm demeanor remained unchanged, but internally, a small alarm went off. This wasn't a routine traffic stop. Larson had crossed the line, making assumptions based solely on Eric's appearance. Officer, I've already complied with everything you've asked, Eric said, his voice firm but polite. I'd appreciate it if you'd just let me go about my day. But Larson wasn't having it. He moved toward the car, his hand resting ominously on his holster as he tried to intimidate Eric into obeying without question. I told you to step out. Now do it, before I make this worse for you. Eric's pulse quickened, but he didn't allow his frustration to show. Instead, he gave a small nod, then slowly opened the door. It was a slow and deliberate motion, a clear sign that he wasn't intimidated by the officer's orders. As Eric stepped out of the car, Larson stood back for a moment, eyeing him like a predator assessing its prey. But as Eric stood tall, his calm demeanor only served to unnerve the officer further. The situation was getting tense, and Larson didn't like that. He wasn't used to anyone challenging him. Hands where I can see them, Larson barked, his tone suddenly more aggressive. Eric raised both hands slowly, palms facing forward. He stood there, looking Larson in the eye, his expression composed and unyielding. The officer's eyes flicked toward the side of the car, and for a brief moment Eric could tell that Larson was considering his next move. As Eric stood calmly with his hands raised in front of him, Officer Larson's arrogance grew palpable. The officer's suspicion was already evident, but now his tone became more venomous, as if he were trying to provoke a reaction. His eyes darted from Eric's face to his well-tailored suit, his hand resting, a little too casually, on his holster. It was clear to Eric that Larson was making an assumption about him based solely on his appearance. Look, I've been doing this job long enough to know when something's off, Larson said, his voice gruff, and something doesn't sit right about you. Eric didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. Officer, I've told you I'm just on my way home. What is it exactly that you think is off? Eric's voice was controlled, but it carried an edge of incredulity. He was no stranger to being treated differently because of his race, but something about this situation felt more dangerous. Larson was clearly looking for any excuse to escalate. Larson wasn't done. He stepped closer to Eric, his voice dropping to a lower, more condescending register. It's just that people like you, well, you don't usually belong in places like this. There it was, the subtle but unmistakable hint of racism. Larson wasn't even bothering to hide it anymore. Eric felt the sharp sting of the words, but he didn't let them affect him. He had been in situations like this before, and he had learned long ago that it was better to stay calm and let the situation play itself out. People like me? Eric asked, keeping his voice even. Larson didn't seem to realize the weight of his words. He was so caught up in his own assumptions that he didn't even pause to think about what he had said. He waved a hand dismissively, as if trying to brush off the discomfort he had just caused. Yeah, you know, I don't see many people like you around here, Larson muttered, clearly not interested in hearing Eric's side of the story. Not many of your kind hang out in neighborhoods like this. What are you really doing here? Eric's mind raced as Larson's words sank in. He had been pulled over simply because of his appearance. The officer was not even trying to hide the bias that fueled his actions. But Eric wasn't about to let Larson push him around, not without making sure the officer knew exactly who he was dealing with. Eric's voice remained calm, but there was a firmness to it now. You have no reason to treat me like this, Officer Larson. I'm just trying to get home, but if you want to escalate this, we can do it the right way. I don't mind waiting for your supervisor to arrive. Larson's eyes narrowed at the mention of his supervisor. He hadn't expected that response. It was clear now that Eric wasn't the type of person who would back down in the face of petty authority. Yeah, sure. We'll see about that, Larson grumbled. His pride was starting to show, and Eric could see that the officer wasn't used to being challenged. It was a dangerous combination, an officer who believed his badge gave him the right to make assumptions about people, and an ego too large to admit when he was wrong. Fine, you want to wait for my supervisor? Larson said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Go ahead, but don't think it's going to change anything. Eric kept his posture straight and his eyes locked on Larson, but on the inside, he was already thinking ahead. He knew he had to be careful. As much as Larson was the one in the wrong, Eric couldn't afford to let things escalate into violence or a confrontation that could be misinterpreted. He had the upper hand, but he needed to play it smart. As the officer stood there, still seething with impatience, Eric reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his phone. He didn't make a big show of it. He simply pulled it out and unlocked it, knowing that soon he would need to make a call. There was only so much that words could do. It was time for action. Larson stood there for a moment, still glaring at Eric, his hands twitching as if he was ready to snap at any second. He was clearly growing frustrated by Eric's calm demeanor and refusal to be intimidated. The officer's professional facade was starting to crumble, and it was becoming clear that he didn't know how to handle a situation where the other person wasn't bowing to his authority. Look, I don't know who you think you are, Larson muttered, his voice tight, but you can't just act like you're above the law. This is how things are done here. Eric raised an eyebrow. How things are done where? Larson waved a hand dismissively again, this time more agitated. You think you can just waltz into this neighborhood and not expect any questions? People like you don't belong here. Eric's blood began to boil, but he kept his cool. The officer had crossed the line. It wasn't about the traffic violation anymore. This was about Larson's deep-rooted prejudice, and Eric was not going to let him get away with it. You've made your point, officer, Eric said, his voice still steady. But you're wrong about me. I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm just here to live my life like anyone else. Larson's lip curled into a sneer. Yeah, well, you should be thankful I'm being this nice. I could arrest you right now for interfering with an officer's duties. Eric's expression remained unshaken, though internally he could feel his pulse quickening. He knew what Larson was trying to do. He was trying to provoke him, trying to get a rise out of him so he could justify his actions. But Eric wasn't going to give him that satisfaction. I haven't done anything wrong, Officer Larson, Eric replied calmly, pulling out his badge from his coat pocket. But I think you need to start explaining yourself. Larson froze for a split second, his eyes flicking from the badge in Eric's hand to Eric's calm face. He hadn't been expecting that. The smug look on his face began to fade as he realized the badge in Eric's hand wasn't just any badge. It was the badge of someone who could make his life a lot more difficult. Your internal affairs? Larson stammered, his voice now tinged with uncertainty. Eric didn't respond right away. Instead, he allowed the question to hang in the air, letting it sink in. The officer's smugness had disappeared, replaced by an expression of confusion and slowly, fear. That's right, Eric said after a beat. I'm the head of internal affairs, and I don't take kindly to officers who think they can harass people based on assumptions. Larson's face drained of color. The tension in the air had shifted dramatically. Eric could see the wheels turning in Larson's mind as the realization settled in. He had just made a grave mistake, a huge, career-threatening mistake. The change in Officer Larson was immediate. His body stiffened, and he took a half step back as if the weight of the situation had finally hit him. His eyes darted nervously toward his cruiser, then back at Eric, unable to hide the growing panic. This was no longer a routine traffic stop. The power dynamic had shifted, and it was Larson who was now at a disadvantage. Eric didn't let the officer's discomfort distract him. He kept his voice steady and firm, making sure Larson understood the gravity of the situation. You've just violated multiple procedures, Larson. You've racially profiled me and escalated a situation that didn't need escalation. You've been disrespectful, and you've put yourself in a position where your actions will be investigated. Larson sputtered, trying to regain some semblance of control. This is this is a misunderstanding. I didn't know who you were, and now Eric raised a hand to stop him. I don't care what you thought, Larson. What matters now is that you've crossed the line and you're going to be held accountable for it. Larson tried to recover, but his confidence had evaporated. The smug officer, who had thought he could intimidate a random driver, was now fumbling for words. His earlier accusations, his attempts to assert control over the situation, all of it now seemed hollow and pathetic in the face of the truth. Please, Larson began, his voice shaking. I didn't mean any harm. Eric cut him off. No, what you did was intentional, and you know it. You've had your moments of power, and now it's time to answer for them. I'll be filing a report, Larson, and trust me, you don't want internal affairs to start looking into your record. For a moment, there was only silence between them, the air heavy with the weight of what had just unfolded. Larson stood frozen, unable to respond, while Eric stood tall and composed, his resolve firm. The truth had come to light, and there was no turning back for Officer Larson now. As Eric's words sank in, the reality of the situation began to hit Larson, but his pride and arrogance wouldn't allow him to admit defeat. He wasn't about to let a black man, especially one he had already deemed unworthy of the good neighborhoods, stand there calmly, exposing his errors. Larson's face flushed a deep red, his gaze flickering between Eric's confident posture and the internal affairs badge still hanging in his hand. You think you can just waltz in here and make threats like that? Larson spat, his voice shaking with frustration. I've been doing this job long enough to know how things work around here. You don't scare me? Eric held his ground, not flinching at Larson's outburst. It was clear the officer was grasping for control, trying to reassert his dominance in a situation where he no longer had the upper hand. Eric, however, wasn't intimidated. His composure was his weapon. I'm not trying to scare you, Larson, Eric said, his voice smooth and steady. I'm simply stating the facts. You've crossed a line, and I'll make sure the proper people hear about it. Larson's hands began to tremble, but he masked it with a forced sneer. What are you going to do? File a report? Is that it? You think that's going to change anything? His words were filled with bitter sarcasm, and his expression grew darker, the wheels turning in his head as he tried to think of a way to talk his way out of this. Eric didn't respond immediately. Instead, he watched Larson closely, noticing how his body language shifted. The officer was clearly trying to regain control, but his forced confidence was beginning to unravel. Eric's calmness seemed to rattle him even more. Larson wasn't used to dealing with someone who wasn't intimidated by his badge and authority. Eric slowly slid his phone out of his pocket, casually unlocking it. I'm not interested in playing games with you, Larson. You've already made enough mistakes today. Larson's eyes flickered to the phone in Eric's hand, his jaw tightening. What's that supposed to mean? He growled, his suspicion evident. Just calling someone who will make sure your actions are properly documented, Eric replied, his tone so calm it almost seemed casual. But there was an edge to his words that made Larson realize he wasn't just talking about filing a report. Eric wasn't bluffing. Larson's panic became more obvious as Eric spoke. He began pacing back and forth, muttering under his breath, trying to think of any way to salvage the situation. But it was too late. Eric was no longer just a victim of the officer's assumptions. He was in complete control of the narrative. I don't know what you think you can do, Larson muttered, turning away. I didn't do anything wrong. This is just a misunderstanding. Eric watched him for a moment, studying Larson's every move. The officer's movements were growing more erratic, more desperate. Larson was clearly trying to maintain the illusion of control, but it was slipping from his grasp with every passing second. No, Larson, Eric said, his voice firm, his eyes locking with Larson's. This is no misunderstanding. What you did was intentional, and you know it. Larson froze, the words cutting through the cloud of denial that had settled over him. He opened his mouth to argue, but no words came out. The confidence he had once had was completely gone, replaced by a growing fear. His stomach churned, and his mind raced as he realized the full weight of the situation. He had just targeted the wrong person, someone who had the power to ruin his career and everything he had worked for. Look, I didn't mean to overstep, Larson stammered, his voice barely a whisper. I'm just doing my job. I've got a lot of pressure, okay? You don't know what it's like. Eric took a slow, deliberate step forward, his presence towering over Larson. I don't care about your excuses, Larson. The truth is, you targeted me because of the way I look. You assumed things about me that weren't true. You were wrong, and now you have to deal with the consequences. Larson's face was pale now, his confidence shattered. The officer's hands were clenched into fists, his knuckles white as he fought the urge to lash out. But Eric wasn't going to give him that satisfaction. I didn't ask for this, Larson, Eric continued, his voice cold but measured. I didn't ask for you to treat me like a criminal just because of my skin color. I didn't ask for you to disrespect me, to assume I didn't belong here. But now you're going to answer for it. Larson opened his mouth, his mind scrambling for a defense, but the words didn't come. He knew it was over. He had crossed the line, and there was no going back. For a moment, everything was still. Larson was left speechless, his mind struggling to catch up with the reality of the situation. Eric stood before him, unwavering, calm, and in complete control. The officer had no power here. In this moment, Larson was the one who was vulnerable. The silence between them stretched on, heavy with the weight of what had just been revealed. Larson tried to summon some semblance of authority, but the words wouldn't come. He had been caught in his own web of prejudice and lies, and there was no escaping the truth. Eric didn't break the silence. He simply stood there, waiting. He knew Larson had to process everything. The officer had to come to terms with the fact that his career, and possibly his freedom, was on the line now. You're not going to get away with this. The tension in the air was palpable, heavy with the weight of truth that was beginning to settle in. Officer Larson stood frozen, his earlier bravado all but evaporated, replaced with a dawning realization that his assumptions had led him down a path from which there was no turning back. Eric stood before him, calm and composed, a stark contrast to the officer's growing panic. The situation had shifted entirely. Larson had been so sure of himself moments ago. He had believed he could intimidate Eric into compliance, that his badge would shield him from scrutiny. But Eric had turned the tables, revealing not just his role within the Internal Affairs Department, but his unshakable confidence in holding the officer accountable for his actions. For a moment, Larson's eyes flickered nervously between Eric's unwavering gaze and the badge in his hand, and then to the phone that was still in Eric's grip, the device that had already begun its role in documenting the entire interaction. Larson opened his mouth to speak, but the words never came. He had nothing left to say. The truth had come out, and there was no way to undo what had been done. Eric could see the wheels turning in Larson's mind, but it was too late. The officer had already crossed the line. The quiet hum of the neighborhood, the chirping of distant birds, the sound of a passing car, all these mundane elements seemed so ordinary in contrast to the monumental shift happening in that moment. Larson's career, his pride, his sense of power, it was all crashing down before him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Do you understand now? Eric's voice was calm but carried a quiet authority that resonated deep within Larson. I'm not just any driver you've pulled over. I'm the person you've just made an irreversible mistake with, and now you'll have to face the consequences." Larson's face was ashen now, a mix of confusion, fear, and disbelief washing over him. His legs felt weak, as though the ground beneath him had suddenly turned to sand. His career, which had been built on arrogance and a sense of superiority, was now crumbling before his eyes. I I didn't know," Larson stammered, his voice quivering as he tried to regain some shred of control. "I thought you were just another driver. I didn't know you were with Internal Affairs." Eric's eyes hardened. "You didn't care to know. You didn't care to ask. All you saw was a black man in a nice car, and you assumed that was all there was to me." Larson opened his mouth again, but no words came out. He could feel the weight of Eric's gaze, the realization that every moment of his professional life had just led to this catastrophic mistake. He had let his prejudice cloud his judgment, and now he was paying the price. Eric's calmness in the face of Larson's disintegrating pride only seemed to escalate the officer's discomfort. Larson had dealt with difficult situations before, but none like this. In those moments, he had been able to exert control. In those moments, he had used his badge as a shield to deflect any consequences. But now, there was no deflection. There was no badge to protect him. Eric let the silence stretch out for a moment before speaking again. "It's not just the profiling that's the issue, Larson. It's how you've escalated this situation. You've assumed my guilt without any evidence. You've violated my rights. And you've done all of this with the arrogance of someone who believes they can get away with it. But that's not how things work with me." Larson looked away, his eyes darting to the side, unable to face the full extent of his actions. He had never imagined he'd find himself in this position. It was one thing to harass people from the comfort of his patrol car, but it was another to be confronted with someone who had the power to expose everything he had done wrong. Eric noticed Larson's unease, the way the officer's posture slumped slightly, as if he had just come to terms with the reality of his situation. The power dynamic had completely shifted. There was no way for Larson to deny the truth any longer. The truth had a way of rising to the surface, no matter how much people tried to bury it. And now, the truth was staring Larson right in the face. "I'm going to report this," Eric continued, his voice unwavering. "I'm going to make sure this goes to the highest levels of internal affairs. You'll be investigated, Larson. And when they start looking into your record, there will be no escaping this. You'll be held accountable." Larson's eyes widened and his breathing became shallow. He had heard stories about officers being investigated by Internal Affairs, but he had never thought it would happen to him. Now, the very system he had relied on to protect him was about to tear his world apart. "You can't do this," Larson whispered, his voice tinged with panic. "You don't know what you're doing. You don't understand what this will mean for me." Eric's expression softened, but there was no sympathy in his eyes. "I understand more than you think. I understand what it's like to work in a system that often makes it easy for people to get away with things they shouldn't. That's why I'm here. I'm here to make sure people like you don't get away with it." Larson took a hesitant step back, as if he were retreating from the magnitude of the situation. You're not going to just report me, are you? You can't be serious. This is going to ruin me." Eric's gaze never wavered. "You've already ruined yourself, Larson. All I'm doing is making sure that the consequences match your actions." The moment that had begun as a routine traffic stop now felt like a tense standoff. The officer, once so confident in his own power, had become a man desperate to salvage what was left of his career and reputation. Eric, on the other hand, stood firm, unshaken by Larson's pleas. In this battle of wills, Eric knew he had already won. The system of justice, which Larson had abused for so long, was finally catching up with him. Larson's mind raced, but there were no more lies left to tell. He could feel his pride slipping away with every passing second. The officer's world, once built on control and unquestioned authority, was unraveling in real time. The moment he had raised his voice at Eric, the moment he had made assumptions based on race, was the moment his career had begun its downward spiral. "You really think you can destroy me?" Larson muttered, his voice barely audible, his eyes focused on the ground. He wasn't speaking to Eric anymore. He was speaking to himself, trying to make sense of how he had ended up here, but it was clear that the truth was too much for him to handle. Eric tilted his head, taking in the officer's defeated posture. I'm not destroying you, Larson. You're doing that all on your own. Your actions have consequences. You can't just bully your way through life, thinking you're untouchable. You're not. You're not above the law. Larson's shoulders slumped further, the weight of the words finally sinking in. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone who had the power to strip away his badge. He had gotten away with so much for so long, but now his past misdeeds were catching up to him in the worst way. I didn't ask for this, Larson muttered, his voice heavy with regret. Eric stepped closer, closing the gap between them. None of us ask for the consequences of our actions, Larson. But they're coming. You can't avoid them forever. The officer shifted uncomfortably, his face twisting with embarrassment as he realized that the consequences were already set into motion. His career, his reputation, and everything he had worked for were now at risk. The once confident officer, who had thought himself invincible, was now a man who had no idea how to navigate the fallout of his own choices. Eric reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, holding it up in front of Larson. I'm making a call. The sooner you understand that this is happening, the better for you. Larson's eyes widened as he saw the phone, and a flicker of desperation crossed his face. You can't do this. You can't just destroy me. I have a family. Eric interrupted him, his voice cold and steady. I'm not destroying you, Larson. You did that yourself. But I'll make sure that the people who need to know, know. The officer was speechless now, his fear evident as Eric pressed a few buttons on his phone. The gravity of the situation finally hit him, and there was nothing left to say. Everything had already been said. His pride, his career, and his misguided assumptions had led him to this point, and the consequences were inevitable. As Eric made the call, Larson's face twisted with panic, realizing the full extent of the situation. This was it. His world was crashing down around him. The officer could feel his stomach turn, his breath becoming shallow as he tried to think of any way to undo the damage he had caused. Eric didn't break the silence. He kept his phone pressed to his ear, waiting for the call to go through. Every second felt like an eternity to Larson, and it was clear he was desperate for a way out. I didn't mean to, Larson said, his voice trembling now. I didn't mean to do any of this. Eric's eyes narrowed as he looked at the officer. It doesn't matter whether you meant it or not. What matters is that you did it. And now you have to answer for it. Finally, the call connected, and Eric's voice became calm and controlled as he explained the situation. It was clear now that Larson's fate was sealed. The investigation would begin, and nothing would be able to stop it. Larson turned away, his eyes filled with defeat as the weight of what had just happened crashed down on him. He had crossed a line, and there was no going back. The career he had worked so hard to build was crumbling in front of his eyes. As the call ended, Eric looked at Larson with a sense of finality. The officer's world had changed forever, and there was no escaping the consequences of his actions. Eric had done his part to make sure that the system would hold Larson accountable. You'll be investigated, Eric said softly, and when it's all over, you'll realize how serious this is. Larson nodded slowly, the realization sinking in. There was no way to undo the damage. All he could do now was wait for the inevitable.